I knew something was wrong the moment Daniel's hand tightened on my elbow, guiding me toward the chair as if I were a fragile object he was tired of holding. "Mom," he said softly, the way people do when they want to get their way. "Just sign it. You don't need to understand every detail." That was the moment the bank manager looked up, and I saw it in her eyes. A flicker of pity, then of anger. Not toward me, toward them. I hadn't expected anyone to defend me that day, least of all a stranger behind a polished walnut desk. She closed the folder Daniel had pushed toward her and folded her hands neatly on top of it. "I'm going to need you both to step outside," she said, her voice firm enough to cut the air. "Mrs. Hale stays. You two, leave the room. Right now." For a moment, neither Daniel nor Clara understood. They stood stiff, offended, their confidence cracking. I felt something move inside me, something that had been asleep for years, maybe decades. A quiet heat spreading through my chest. They protested, of course. They always protest when control slips from their hands. Daniel insisted. "We're just helping our mother. She gets confused." Clara chimed in, voice sugary and poisonous. "She asked us to take care of her finances." The bank manager didn't flinch. "Mrs. Hale can speak for herself." She looked at me then, and her expression softened. She waited. I don't know why, but that patience nearly broke me. No one had waited for my words in a long time. When the door finally closed behind them, the silence felt like cool water on a burn. I sat very still, listening to my own breathing. I'm 74, but I'd never felt as old as I did walking into that office. And suddenly, sitting alone with that closed folder in front of me, I didn't feel old at all. Just awake. "Mrs. Hale," the manager said gently, "do you know what they wanted you to sign?" I opened my mouth, closed it, tried again. "No," I admitted. "They said it was for my protection." Her eyes softened again, but not with pity. Thank God, I couldn't have borne pity. "This form," she said, tapping it lightly, "would give your son full access to your investment account, without limitations." The room felt smaller then, as if the walls had leaned in to listen. I thought of my husband, how his hands trembled in the last year of his life, how I managed the books when he couldn't anymore. I'd spent 40 years balancing ledgers, calculating payroll, sorting invoices. Too old to understand money? Nonsense. I understood money too well. I understood what desperation looks like, what entitlement sounds like, and what children are capable of when they believe their mother won't resist. "I didn't ask them to do this," I whispered. The manager leaned back, studying my face as if measuring the truth in it. "I believe you," she said quietly, "and you're not the first." Her words landed like a pebble dropped in a still pond, concentric circles spreading through memories I'd tried to ignore. Daniel's sudden interest in my savings, Clara's comments about responsible planning, their gentle corrections when I asked too many questions, their quick glances at each other when I hesitated. I folded my hands in my lap. They looked older than I remembered, softer, thinner. I wondered when exactly my children decided those hands were no longer mine to use. "Do you want to continue this conversation without them present?" the manager asked. I nodded because I couldn't trust my voice. And then something strange happened. I felt taller, heavier in my own bones, as if I had stepped back into myself after being gone for too long. Outside the office door, I could hear their voices, sharp, irritated whispers. They were arguing with someone at the receptionist's desk. I imagined their faces, red with indignation, rehearsing explanations about how ungrateful I was, how burdensome, how confused. Let them talk. Let them practice their little performance. I sat there with the folder closed in front of me, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like the one who needed to apologize. When the manager left to bring me water, I allowed myself a small exhale. It felt like the beginning of something, though I didn't yet know what. A shift in the ground beneath my feet, a quiet promise forming in my chest. The truth was simple. I wasn't confused. I wasn't fragile. I wasn't theirs to manage. I was Margaret Hale, and I had finally begun to wake up. When I came home that afternoon, the house felt smaller than usual, as if it knew something had shifted in me and was holding its breath. I stood in the hallway longer than I should have, my coat still on, my fingers resting on the edge of the console table where I used to place my husband's letters. It's strange how a place can greet you with silence. Not the gentle kind, but the kind that waits for you to admit something you've been avoiding. I hung my coat carefully, smoothing the sleeve the way I used to smooth his. Old habits, I suppose. They linger when people don't. The living room lay in soft shadow, late sunlight moving across the carpet like a slow tide. I walked to the mantel, touching the frame of our wedding picture. 53 years ago. I was 21, he 24. Both of us certain life would bend kindly if we worked hard enough. And we did. We built a home, a business, a family. When he died, 12 years ago now, I thought grief would be the hardest part. It wasn't. Loneliness was gentler. It whispered. What came after was louder, the way my children slowly shifted from warmth to impatience, from patience to condescension, until I was something between an obligation and an afterthought. I sat down in the old armchair, the cushion sighing under my weight. My hands still trembled slightly from the bank meeting. Not fear, something sharper. Awareness. I'd lived with a low hum of doubt for months, maybe years, but today it grew legs and stood in front of me. I leaned back, letting the memories wash over me. Little things, mostly. Clara snatching bills from my hand. So you don't confuse the notes. Daniel cutting me off mid-sentence when I asked about investments, their glances over my head as if I weren't in the room at all. At first, I thought it was concern. Then I decided it was stress. Today, I understood it was neither. On the far wall, the clock ticked with its usual arrogance, the same sound I'd fallen asleep to for half my life. I watched its hands crawl. I kept thinking back to the manager's face, the way she said, "Mrs. Hale, you can speak for yourself." No one had spoken to me like that in a long while. Not my doctor, who explained medications to my children instead of me. Not the insurance broker, who directed every question to Daniel as if I were invisible. And certainly not my own children, who talked about me in the third person, even when I was in the room. I rose slowly and went to the window. Outside, the sea was restless, a late autumn wind pushing the waves toward the rocks. My house had always felt safe, but that afternoon, it felt like a witness. It knew things I hadn't wanted to say out loud. I watched the gulls dive for food, each movement sharp and determined. There was something enviable about their simplicity. Hunger, flight, survival. Human ties are not so clear. On the small wooden table by the window sat a stack of unopened envelopes. I picked them up, flipping through the return addresses, some from the bank, some from insurance, one from a credit company I'd never used. A familiar unease tightened in my stomach. My children had handled all the paperwork for me this past year. Clara insisted it was less stressful for me. Just sign, Mom. Don't worry about the details. But details matter. Details reveal intention. I placed the envelopes back down, not ready yet to open them, but no longer willing to ignore them. I went into the kitchen, the light colder there, reflecting off the metal sink. I boiled water for tea, more for the comfort of the ritual than the drink itself. As the kettle hissed, I remembered a moment from years ago. Daniel was 12, standing on a stool, helping me wash dishes. He asked me why I always double-checked the numbers at the shop when his father already did them. I told him, because your father trusts me with our life, and I won't allow mistakes with something so precious. He laughed then, splashing water everywhere. What would that boy think of the man he became? Would he recognize himself? I carried my cup to the table and sat. I should have been tired, but I felt strangely alert, awake in places that had been numb. It's a strange thing to realize. Your own children believe you are useful only when silent. But silence is a choice, not a destiny. And I felt something in me refusing to stay quiet. As the sky darkened, I rested my hands on the table and looked at them. Not broken, not frail, only older, and steadier than I expected. The day had shown me something I could no longer unsee. I was not the confused woman my children wanted me to be, and the life they had built around that idea was beginning to crack. I didn't sleep much that night, not because of fear. Fear is something I learned to tame long ago, but because the house felt restless, as if it too sensed the corners of my life shifting out of the dark. Around 3 a.m, I finally rose, wrapped myself in my robe, and walked to the dining room. The moonlit windows cast long rectangles across the floor, faint and cold, like quiet invitations to face what I'd long avoided. The stack of envelopes still sat where I had left it, obedient in their silence. I pulled out a chair, sat down slowly, and began opening them one by one. It felt almost ceremonial, like peeling back layers of my own blindness. The first envelope was from the bank. A statement. At first glance, nothing unusual. Balances, deposits, withdrawals. But then a line caught my eye. An automatic transfer I didn't recognize. Then another. And another. Small amounts, maybe insignificant to someone who never counted pennies. But I always counted. That was the first thing my husband and I learned. Money slips away quietly unless you keep your hands on it. The next envelope was from an insurance company I didn't remember choosing. A policy adjustment, higher premiums. Higher. A beneficiary update. I had not requested any of it. My name was there, handwritten, but I knew my own signature. This one wore my shape, but not my hand. Something inside me sank, not from shock, but from recognition. A truth that had been knocking quietly for months finally stepped through the door. I opened more envelopes. A credit card statement from a company I never applied to. Service charges for accounts I never opened. A loan inquiry stamped with approved pending verification. The name at the bottom, mine, looked identical to the insurance document. Someone had practiced. I pressed both palms flat on the table, grounding myself. My children had never been malicious. But people don't need malice to cause damage. Only a sense of entitlement wrapped in good intentions. I could almost hear Daniel saying, "We're just trying to help you, Mom. Help me by using my name to prop up their financial missteps. Help me by turning my life into a quiet, convenient resource." A floorboard creaked in the hallway. It startled me at first, and then I smiled faintly. The old house was listening, the way it always had. I whispered into the dim room, "I should have looked sooner." The house didn't disagree. something made me rise and go to the sideboard drawer. The drawer where I stored things I didn't want to face. Inside were old check registers, bank letters, tax notices, papers from the year after my husband died. I sifted through them slowly, carefully. My fingers brushed against a small leather-bound ledger I hadn't touched in ages. I opened it, and my breath caught. Inside were records, my records, from the years I managed the books at the shop. Line after line of neat handwriting, balanced columns, precise calculations. Evidence of a younger me who understood every cent that passed through her hands. I touched the pages, feeling them steady me. That woman was still inside me, just quieter. With a renewed steadiness, I pulled out another folder, this one marked household documents, receipts for repairs, service statements, property tax notices. Some were familiar, others not. One bill, for example, was addressed to my home, but sent to Daniel's house. Another listed him as my financial agent, which was something I never officially granted. I felt a soft, precise anger bloom in my chest. Not loud, not hot, just resolute. I carried the folders to the living room and sat on the sofa, surrounded by the paper trail of my life. Outside, the first hint of dawn colored the sky a deep slate blue. The gulls began their early cries. Morning was coming whether I felt ready or not. I took a deep breath and began sorting everything into piles. One for things I recognized, one for things I needed to question, and a third, small but growing, of things that felt like trespass. When I finished, the room looked like a map of everything I'd ignored for too long, a map I now intended to read in full. I leaned back against the sofa and let the quiet settle. For years, my children told me I was forgetful, overwhelmed, too slow to understand modern finances. Maybe I believed them because it was easier than doubting their motives. But today, the silence around me felt cleaner, brighter, as if the house approved of this new clarity. Somewhere in that pile was the truth of how far they'd gone, and I was no longer afraid to find it. By the time the sun lifted itself over the water, pale and exhausted looking, I had already boiled a fresh kettle and laid out the papers in neat rows across the dining table. I don't know what I expected to feel. Fear, perhaps, or shame, but instead, there was a strange steadiness in me, as if my bones had finally remembered their purpose. I was still sitting there when the phone buzzed with a message from Julia, my granddaughter, the only one who ever knocked on my door without wanting anything. "Grandma, are you home this morning? I can stop by before class." I stared at the message for a long moment. Julia always asked, never assumed. Her parents could have learned something from her. I typed back slowly, "Yes, sweetheart. Come whenever you can." And then, after a pause, "I'd like to talk to you." While waiting for her, I tried to tidy the table, but my hands kept returning to the piles of documents, as if touching them confirmed there was nothing imaginary about what I'd uncovered. At 7:30 sharp, I heard a soft knock, not the rushed, annoyed rapping of Clara or the heavy, impatient thud of Daniel. Julia always knocked as if the house itself might be sleeping. She stepped inside with the smell of cold air and coffee clinging to her coat. 19 years old, tall and a little awkward, with my husband's gentle eyes and my own stubborn jaw. She hugged me tightly, the way children hug when they're not afraid of showing affection. "You're up early," she said, slipping off her backpack. "Are you okay?" It's a simple question, but one rarely asked with sincerity. I nodded toward the table. "I've been doing some sorting." She followed my gaze and her brow knitted as she approached the documents. What's all this? I hesitated. It's strange how difficult honesty can be, even with someone who has earned it. I motioned for her to sit. Your father and aunt, I began, my voice quieter than I intended, have been managing certain things for me. Finances, insurance, accounts. Julia nodded slowly. They said you asked them to, she murmured. There was no judgment in her tone, just a careful tread, as if she sensed the edge of something sharp. I folded my hands together. I didn't ask them to open accounts in my name, I said, or sign policies, or move money without telling me. The words weren't bitter, just factual. And the truth, spoken plainly, felt surprisingly light. Julia's eyes widened, her breath catching. They did that? Without you knowing? She picked up one of the letters, an insurance policy with its forged signature, and her fingers trembled. Grandma, this is illegal. I watched her, remembering the little girl who used to sit on my porch steps, counting seashells, always whispering the numbers under her breath, as if they were wishes. She had grown into a careful young woman, deliberate, observant. People do many things, I said softly, when they believe no one is watching. Julia sat back, her expression troubled. Dad always said you were overwhelmed, that it was easier if he handled everything. She swallowed hard. I thought he was helping. So did I whispered. For a while, we sat in silence. The morning light moved across the table, illuminating the papers, turning them into something undeniable. Julia reached over and placed her hand on mine. Her touch was steady, warm. What are you going to do? No one had asked me that yet. Not Daniel, not Clara. They told me what I should do, never what I wanted. I looked at Julia, really looked, and saw something honest in her. Something that didn't want control or comfort, only truth. I'm not sure yet, I said honestly, but I know I won't stay silent. She nodded, her jaw tightening with a seriousness that made her look older. You don't deserve this, she whispered. For a moment my voice nearly broke, not from sadness, but from the unfamiliar relief of being seen. Thank you, Julia. She helped me stack the papers, her movements quiet, careful. If you want, I can go with you, she said suddenly. Wherever you need to go next. The bank, the police, a lawyer. You don't have to do this alone. The house seemed to inhale at her words, as if even its walls recognized the weight of them. I reached out and touched her cheek, marveling at how soft youth still is. You're very kind, I said. But this is something I need to start on my own. Julia didn't argue. She just nodded and squeezed my hand, grounding me. When she finally left for class, I stood in the doorway long after her footsteps faded. The sea was louder now, the wind pulling at the waves with impatient hands. The world outside was changing, but something in me had already begun to change first. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like a burden. I felt like a woman reclaiming her life, one document at a time. Daniel called before noon, as if he could sense that my morning had been too calm for his comfort. His name flashed across the screen, bright and insistent, but I let it ring. Twice. 3 times. I knew what he wanted. He wanted to regain the narrative before it slipped too far from his hands. When the 4th call came, I answered, not because I owed him anything, but because silence can sometimes be mistaken for fear. Mom, he began, his voice already heavy with annoyance. You left the bank before we finished talking. Clara and I were worried. I could hear Clara in the background, directing him, whispering sharp little cues. I imagined her tapping her perfectly manicured nails against the countertop, irritated that her morning had been disrupted by a mother-in-law who refused to be pliable. I left, I said calmly, because there was nothing left to discuss. A long pause. I pictured Daniel blinking, taken aback by the firmness in my voice. Mom, you don't understand. That manager overstepped. She embarrassed us for no reason. He exhaled sharply. We're trying to protect you. There it was, that familiar phrase that had been used as a leash for too many years. I walked to the window, looking out at the restless ocean. I'm not in danger, Daniel. You are, he insisted, frustration rising. Mom, you don't know how vulnerable you are. Scams, frauds, bad decisions. You're not as sharp about finances anymore. You should let us handle things. I traced a finger along the cold glass. I handled finances for 40 years. And things have changed, he snapped. You're 74, Mom. You forget things. You get overwhelmed. Clara and I agreed that it's better if we take responsibility. For your sake. That word, responsibility, landed like a weight on my chest. Responsibility is something you assume with care, not something you seize for convenience. What exactly, I asked softly, do you think you need to protect me from? Another pause. Clara whispered something again, sharper this time. Daniel cleared his throat. From making mistakes. From signing things you don't understand. From mismanaging your accounts. I almost laughed. The irony was too sharp to ignore. I looked back at the pile of documents Julia and I had sorted that morning. It seems, I said, that someone has been managing my accounts. Without my knowledge. The silence on the other end was immediate, thick, and telling. Mom, Daniel said finally, his tone shifting to false patience. You're misinterpreting things. We only stepped in when you started getting confused. Confused? Such a convenient word. Daniel, I said. I know about the accounts, the transfers, the policies, the signatures. Another silence. This one colder. You're being dramatic, he muttered. Clara thought this might happen, that you'd get suspicious and misunderstand. It's why we've been trying to get you to sign the new authorization form. It would make everything easier. Official. Easier. For whom? Daniel, I said gently, because gentleness was all I could offer now. You've been using my name to fix your financial mistakes. That isn't protection. That's exploitation. He inhaled sharply, anger flaring. How dare you? After everything we do for you? After all the time we spend making sure you're safe? You haven't visited me in 3 weeks, I interrupted. That's not fair, he snapped. No, I said quietly. It's true. For a moment, I heard only his breathing, fast, uneven, the sound of a man cornered by a truth he didn't want. Mom, he said finally, Clara and I are coming over tonight. We need to sort this out in person. I don't think that's necessary. Yes, he insisted, the old authority creeping back into his voice. It is. You're making decisions without guidance. Guidance, another word that had been polished into a tool. I closed my eyes. I'll let you know when I'm ready to talk. Mom? I ended the call. The quiet afterward was almost physical, settling around me like a soft blanket. I returned to the dining table and placed my hands on the documents again. They no longer frightened me. They no longer felt like mysteries. They were simply evidence of neglect, of entitlement, of a pattern I had allowed because love can be blinding. But I was beginning to see again. That afternoon, Clara sent a message filled with feigned sweetness. We're only trying to help you, Margaret. please stop making this difficult." Daniel followed with his own. "We'll handle everything once we get the paperwork sorted. Don't stress yourself." I didn't reply. Instead, I sat by the window with a cup of cooling tea, looking out at the shifting sea. The gulls were louder that day, fighting the wind with wild, determined wings. Their cries reminded me of something I had forgotten. A woman who has spent her life surviving doesn't suddenly become helpless, no matter how convenient it is for others to believe she does. The next morning, I woke before the sun, though I wasn't sure if it was the light or my own thoughts that lifted me out of sleep. Something inside me felt restless, almost impatient. It had been years since I'd felt anything close to urgency. My life had settled into a quiet rhythm. Tea at dawn, the sea outside my window, the familiar ache in my knees. But now there was a pulse beneath everything, a slow and steady reminder that I was not as powerless as my children preferred to imagine. I dressed carefully, choosing the dark wool coat I used to wear to the shop when I still worked alongside my husband. The fabric was worn at the cuffs, but sturdy, dependable, much like the woman inside it, though Daniel would argue otherwise. Before leaving the house, I gathered the folders I'd sorted with Julia's help. They felt like armor. The bank opened at 9, but I arrived early, sitting in my car in the quiet parking lot. The wind had picked up overnight, and the tall grass near the sidewalk bent in trembling arcs. I watched it for a while, marveling at how even something so fragile refused to stay still. When the lights inside the building flicked on, I stepped out of the car and walked toward the door. The lobby was empty, except for a young teller who straightened in surprise when she saw me. Her smile was warm, genuine, something I wasn't accustomed to from strangers anymore. "Good morning, Mrs. Hale. Do you have an appointment?" "I need to speak with the branch manager," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. She nodded and gestured toward the waiting area. I sat, resting the folders in my lap, smoothing the edges with my thumb. When the manager emerged from her office, she recognized me instantly. "Mrs. Hale," she said, coming toward me with quick steps. "I'm glad you came back." She led me into her office, closing the door behind us. The air inside felt different from the day before, calmer, more deliberate. She waited until I sat before taking her seat. "How are you feeling today?" It was a simple question, but unexpectedly kind. "I'm thinking more clearly than I have in a long time," I said. "And I need copies of every account linked to my name, every policy, every automatic transfer. Everything my children may have touched." Her expression softened into something like respect. "Of course. I can print those records for you. It might take some time." "I don't mind waiting." She stood and began gathering documents from various drawers, checking her computer, printing pages that spilled into neat stacks. When she returned, she placed them gently on the desk between us. "There's quite a bit here. Some of these accounts were opened through online authorizations. The signatures aren't, well, they're not consistent." I didn't react. I simply nodded and opened the top folder. Page after page showed things I had never approved: transfers marked as family support, checks deposited into Daniel's account, fees I did not recognize. And then something else: a line of credit in my name marked as inactive but approved. "Your children submitted that application 3 months ago," the manager said softly. "We flagged it because the documentation didn't look right. I wanted to speak with you before anything was finalized." The room grew very still. My heart didn't race. It didn't break. It simply settled, heavier and wiser. "Thank you," I murmured. She leaned forward. Mrs. Hale, would you like us to freeze the accounts temporarily until you've had a chance to speak with a financial advisor? I looked down at the papers, at the proof of decisions made about my life without my consent. Yes, I said. Freeze everything they can reach. The manager nodded. We'll secure your accounts today. No transactions will go through without your direct approval. Direct approval. 2 simple words, and yet they felt like a door unlocking inside me. While she processed the requests, I sat quietly, listening to the faint hum of the printer and the occasional shuffle of paper. I thought about the years I let Daniel and Clara handle things out of trust, or perhaps out of habit. I thought about the assumptions they made, the way they spoke over me, the way they used age as both a shield and a weapon. I thought, too, about how easily I had let them. When the manager finished, she handed me a final sheet outlining the account protections. You've taken an important step, she said gently. I gathered the papers, feeling their weight. It shouldn't have taken a stranger to remind me I'm capable. She smiled faintly. Sometimes it takes exactly that. As I walked out of the bank, the cold air hit my face like a blessing. The wind pushed against me, but it felt less like resistance and more like encouragement, an invisible hand guiding me forward. For the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of what my children might think. I was only concerned with what I knew to be true. And today, truth was finally on my side. I didn't go straight home from the bank. I drove instead to a quiet street near the harbor, where the old brick building of Whitmore and Lowry attorneys still stood as stubbornly as it had when my husband and I first walked through its doors decades ago. Back then, we were young, planning wills and insurance as if we had all the time in the world. I remember the smell of the place, old paper, polished wood, a hint of worn carpet, and stepping through the door that morning felt like stepping into an old memory that had somehow become heavier with meaning. The receptionist, a slim woman with silver hair pulled into a tight bun, looked up with a warm, almost relieved smile. Mrs. Hale, she said, rising to her feet, it's been a long time. Are you here to see Mr. Whitmore? Yes, I said quietly, if he has time. For you, he does. Her tone was gentle, almost protective. She led me down the hall, the wooden floor creaking beneath our steps. Time had not improved the building, but it hadn't ruined it either. There's something comforting in places that age without pretending otherwise. Mr. Whitmore was older now, his hair nearly white, his glasses thicker. But when he looked up and saw me standing in the doorway, his expression softened with something like recognition and something like concern. Margaret, he murmured, come in. Sit. Tell me what brings you. I sat down across from him and placed the folders on his desk. I need help, I said, understanding what's been done in my name. He didn't interrupt. He simply opened the first folder and began reading, his brow slowly tightening as he flipped through the pages. Every so often he made a quiet sound, half sigh, half disapproval. Finally, he closed the folder and looked at me over the rims of his glasses. How long? He asked gently. Have your children been using your accounts? I don't know, I admitted. I only discovered the documents yesterday. He nodded slowly. It often starts that way. Small steps, small liberties, and before you know it, they've built an entire structure around your silence. I didn't flinch. I let it happen, I said. Not because I couldn't understand, but because I didn't want to believe they would take advantage. That's what most mothers say. he replied, not unkindly. Love is a powerful fog. He opened another folder, this one containing the forged signature, and slid it across the desk. This isn't your hand. No, I said. But it's close enough that they thought I wouldn't notice. He tapped the page with a thoughtful finger. This is forgery, Margaret. And the accounts they opened under your name, those are unauthorized financial instruments. You could file charges. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The idea of pressing charges against my own children felt like holding a blade by the wrong end. Painful, wrong, but also revealing. How much had I allowed for fear of confrontation? I'm not looking to punish them, I said. I'm looking to protect myself. Mr. Whitmore leaned back in his chair, studying me with a depth that made me feel both exposed and understood. Then we begin by revoking every power of attorney you may have signed, even the informal ones. He picked up a pen. And we establish a new structure, one they cannot access. A trust? I asked softly. Yes, irrevocable, if that is what you choose, with you retaining control and only one successor trustee. A strange heaviness settled in my chest, not dread, but the weight of choice. Julia, I whispered. He nodded. I suspected as much. He drafted letters, explained the legal steps with patience, never once raising his voice or rushing me. I listened carefully, my mind clearer than it had been in years. I understood the documents. I understood the implications. My children would be furious. They would accuse me of betrayal, of cruelty, of losing my mind. They would call it selfishness. But I knew what selfishness truly looked like. It wasn't what I was doing today. It was what they had been doing for years. When the paperwork was ready for signatures, Mr. Whitmore paused, pen hovering above the page. Margaret, he said quietly, this is the first time I've seen you come in alone. Your husband was always the one leading the conversation. And after he passed, your children. I nodded. But today, he said, offering the pen, you're leading. I looked down at the documents, the legal language crisp and final. My hand didn't tremble as I signed. Not once. When I finished, something inside me felt clean, as if the clutter of years had finally been swept aside. When I stepped back outside, the sky had cleared. The air smelled of salt and distant rain. I walked to my car with a steadiness I hadn't felt in a decade. My children still believed they controlled the board. What they didn't know was that today I'd finally made my first move. I drove home from the attorney's office with the windows cracked open, letting the cold coastal air fill the car. It had a bite to it, sharp enough to keep me awake, sharp enough to remind me that clarity was a living thing, not a thought. The road curved along the water, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel small behind the wheel. Age hasn't diminished me. It simply rearranged my strength into quieter places. When I reached the house, the porch steps creaked as usual, greeting me with their familiar complaint. Inside, the light was soft and gray, filtering through the curtains in thin ribbons. I set the folders on the kitchen table and filled the kettle again, though I didn't particularly want tea. It was simply a ritual, one that made the house feel inhabited and me less alone. As the water heated, I began gathering every document I could find. Insurance papers, old bank statements, receipts, account summaries. Even the meaningless newsletters Daniel insisted I just sign and forward. I sorted them into piles, some already understood, others still unread. But the pile that mattered most was the one I set to the side, the one marked mentally as evidence. Evidence of a slow erosion I had mistaken for care. The kettle whistled, but I ignored it. I switched it off and stood there with my hand resting on the counter, letting the warmth of the metal seep into my palm. Strange how comfort appears in places that have nothing to do with kindness. I sat down, opened the first folder Mr. Whitmore had given me, and reviewed every bolded note. Powers revoked. Access terminated. Accounts restricted. Signature protections enabled. Simple words, but they felt like a line being drawn, not against my children, but between the truth and the version of me they'd decided was easier to handle. Halfway through my reading, my phone buzzed. A message from Daniel. The preview alone carried the heat of his irritation. "We need those documents signed today. Stop delaying. You're making things harder than they need to be. It would have frightened me before. It didn't now." I set the phone face down, its vibration muffled against the wooden table. A second message arrived from Clara. "Your accounts aren't responding to our login. Did you change something? Let us help you, for God's sake." Help? Such a generous word, used so cheaply. I pushed the phone aside and returned to the papers. I underlined figures, circled dates, and found patterns I should have noticed years ago. But that's the thing about neglect. It hides itself in plain view. Every time I shrugged off a question, every time I trusted without checking, every time I accepted their impatience as a kind of love, the hole grew wider. By noon, I had built something resembling a picture of my own life without the comforting veil I'd draped over it. The discovery didn't break me. It steadied me. At one point, I walked to the window and opened it wide. The sea wind rushed in, scattering a few papers and lifting the curtains like wings. The house suddenly felt alive, as if it approved of what I was doing. Or perhaps it was simply relieved that its walls were no longer holding secrets for me. I sat again, calmer now, and made a new stack. Documents I would bring to the bank next. Questions I needed answered. Transfers that required reversal. I made a list in my handwriting, still neat, still mine, of every account Daniel and Clara no longer had the power to touch. It was a long list. As the afternoon slanted toward evening, my phone rang again. Daniel. This time calling, not texting. I watched it vibrate, watched his name pulse across the screen. There was a time I would have rushed to answer, not out of obligation, but out of habit, out of the belief that children deserve immediate access to their mother's attention. But habits break when the truth is louder than fear. I let the call go to voicemail. As the ringing stopped, the silence afterward was oddly comforting, like a room finally cleared of noise, leaving only what matters. I exhaled slowly and gathered the final stack of documents. Tomorrow, I would take the next step. More freezes, more cancellations, more boundaries made visible in ink and signatures. Outside, the waves crashed against the breakwater with a kind of stubborn rhythm. The world didn't change because I made a decision, but I changed within it. And that, I realized, was enough. For years, my children moved through my life as if it were theirs to manage. Today, for the first time, the balance shifted, and I felt the ground steady beneath my feet. By the time evening settled over the house, I had made peace with the silence. It wasn't empty the way it used to be. It felt earned, like a clean floor after years of dust. But my children didn't share that peace. The first message came from Daniel just after 6. "Mom, why aren't the transfers going through?" The mortgage payment bounced. Did you touch something you shouldn't have? Call me. I stared at the screen, feeling nothing sharp. No spike of guilt, no wave of fear. Just a simple, quiet awareness. He wasn't worried about me. He was worried about consequences. A familiar story. Then came another message, this time longer. This isn't funny. Clara's furious. We've spent years keeping things organized for you. If you start changing things on your own, everything will spiral. You need to stop before you create a disaster. A disaster for whom, I wondered. I placed the phone on the table again, screen down. The house was dim except for the small lamp in the corner, casting a warm puddle of light that made the room feel smaller, safer. I sat there listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator and the slow ticking of the clock on the wall. Ordinary sounds. Steady sounds. The kind that remind you that life continues even when people demand your attention, like unpaid debts. At 7:30, the phone began ringing again. Daniel, then Clara, then Daniel again. The persistence was almost impressive. For years, I mistook this urgency for love, for responsibility. Now I understood it for what it was. Panic from people who had grown used to a privilege they never bothered to earn. On the fourth attempt, I let the call go to voicemail. When the alert chimed, I pressed play, holding the phone a careful distance from my ear. "Mom?" Daniel said, trying and failing to sound calm. "We need to talk. Right now. I don't know what's gotten into you, but undo whatever you did at the bank. Clara is embarrassed. The financial advisor we work with is asking questions, and it looks like you're undermining everything we've put in place." Everything they put in place. Without me. Around me. Never with me. His tone sharpened. "If you don't call me back tonight, I'm coming over. We can't let this get any worse." I ended the message and set the phone aside, letting my hand rest on the table until the tension left it. I looked around the room at the stacks of documents, at the small arc of lamplight falling across the wooden surface. This was my home. My life. My decisions. And for the first time in years, no one else's hands were on the steering wheel. A soft knock came at the door a little after 8. Not forceful, not demanding, just hesitant. I knew immediately it wasn't Daniel or Clara. They didn't knock like that. They knocked as if the house owed them entry. When I opened the door, a gust of cold air slipped inside, followed by the sight of Julia standing on the porch, arms wrapped around herself, her cheeks red from the wind. "Grandma," she said softly, "Dad's been calling me. He says you're confused and refusing to talk. I wanted to check on you." Her voice, unlike theirs, carried no accusation, only concern. I stepped aside to let her in. "I'm not confused," I said. "I've never been clearer." She nodded, her eyes scanning the table, the papers, the pen still resting beside my notes. "They're panicking," she whispered. "I've never seen Dad like this." I poured her a cup of tea, and we sat together at the table. Outside, the wind rattled the loose gutter, a sound I'd always meant to fix but never quite managed to. Julia held her cup between her palms, staring into the steam. "What are you going to do?" she asked finally. I looked at the documents, the revoked authorizations, the frozen accounts, the list of protections now in place. "I'm going to let them feel the weight of their choices," I said quietly. "And I'm going to protect what's mine." Julia reached out, covering my hand with hers. No pity, just solidarity. "Good," she whispered. Her voice trembled just a little, and in that tremble, I heard something I hadn't expected. Pride. Outside, the wind faded. The house settled. And for the first time in a very long time, I didn't feel like someone waiting to be scolded. I felt like a woman finally returning to herself. Daniel didn't wait until morning. I should have expected that. When a person grows accustomed to access, any boundary feels like an insult. I had just finished washing the dinner dishes when headlights swept across my front windows, cutting through the dimness like a blade. A car door slammed, hard, irritated. And then another. Clara's sharper footsteps followed Daniel's heavy ones up the walkway. They didn't knock. They pounded. "Mom, open the door. We need to talk." I dried my hands slowly, deliberately. Not out of spite, out of calm. A calm I never knew I possessed. When I finally opened the door, Daniel pushed past me with the entitled energy of someone stepping into his own living room. Clara followed, her coat still on, her face tight with irritation. "I've been calling you all day," Daniel snapped. "Why didn't you answer?" "Because I didn't want to," I said simply. That startled him more than anger would have. Clara crossed her arms and scanned the room, her gaze landing on the table with all the documents. "So it's true," she murmured. "You've been making changes." I walked back to the table and sat, letting them stand. "Yes," I said. "I've taken back control of my accounts." Daniel's voice rose. "Control? You've created chaos. The mortgage payment didn't go through. The advisor can't access anything. Our accountant is confused." "Your accountant," I corrected gently, "is not mine." He stared at me, chest heaving. I could see the boy he once was, frustrated when he couldn't bend the world his way. But now that boy was in a man's body, with a man's ability to cause harm. "Mom," Clara said, stepping forward, softening her voice in that calculated way she used whenever she wanted compliance. "This isn't safe. You're making decisions you don't fully understand. Let us help." Help. Always that word. "I understand just fine," I said. "I understand that accounts were opened without my consent. I understand that money was moved behind my back. I understand that my signature was forged." Daniel flinched. Barely, but I saw it. "That's not what happened," he began, but Clara cut him off with a quick glance, sharp, warning. "Mom," she said, "we've been doing everything for your benefit. You can't imagine how stressful it's been. Handling your bills, keeping your home in order, making sure you don't fall for scams." I raised a hand. She stopped speaking. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. "I am not falling for scams," I said. "But I have been deceived." Her eyes flashed. "Are you accusing us?" "I'm stating facts." Daniel took a step closer, his jaw clenched. "If you freeze the accounts, how are we supposed to manage things? How are we supposed to keep the bills paid?" "By paying your own," I replied. The room went utterly still. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the old gutter again, punctuating the silence. "You're being irrational," Daniel said. "You're letting someone get into your head. Who is it? That bank manager? A neighbor? Julia?" He pointed toward the table, toward the documents neatly arranged like evidence. "You don't gather papers like this on your own. Someone is manipulating you." A strange ache rose in my chest. Not pain, but sadness. Sadness for the distance in his voice, for the man he had chosen to become. "No one is manipulating me," I said. "I am finally listening to myself." He shook his head, pacing now, running a hand through his hair. "This is unbelievable. We've spent years trying to build a system to make your life easier. And now you're tearing it apart because you suddenly think we're the villains." "I never said villains," I answered quietly. "But you've forgotten that helping someone requires consent." "You never asked for mine. Clara's voice sharpened. So what now? What's your plan? To cut us out? To accuse us of theft? To let some lawyer convince you we're monsters? I met her gaze steadily. My plan is simple. I will take care of my own life, and you will take care of yours. Daniel stopped pacing. His face had gone pale, tight with anger. He didn't know how to manage. If you don't reverse these changes, he said, voice low, you're going to force our hand. I stood. Slowly. Deliberately. I'm not afraid of your hand, I said. I'm afraid of losing myself, and that is something I will not allow anymore. Neither spoke. Neither moved. For the first time in years, my silence belonged to me. Daniel finally exhaled, sharp and bitter. Fine, he muttered. Do what you want, but don't say we didn't try. They left without another word, their footsteps angry on the porch, their car tearing away with a spiteful roar. When the sound faded, the house relaxed around me. Timbers settling, pipes humming softly, as if the whole structure had been holding its breath. I sat down, folded my hands, and felt an unexpected stillness settle inside my chest. It wasn't victory, not yet, but it was the first real peace I'd tasted in years. The house was quiet the next morning, the kind of quiet that feels less like absence and more like breathing space. I moved through the rooms slowly, opening curtains, watering the plants, letting light spill into corners that had long been dim. There was no urgency in my steps, no anxious checking of the phone. I had spent years living in reaction to other people's demands. Now the silence felt like a room I hadn't entered in decades. Daniel and Clara didn't call. Not once. I suppose they were giving me the punishment they knew best. Withdrawal. They had done it before on smaller scales. A cold tone, delayed replies, a weekend of pointed silence. They used quiet the way some people use raised voices. But this time, something in their silence no longer reached me. Their absence didn't feel heavy. It felt clarifying. Around midday, I made myself tea and sat by the window overlooking the water. The tide was low, exposing the dark rocks beneath, jagged and unapologetic. I'd always preferred the sea in these moods, raw, unmasked. It reminded me of truths we're taught to soften: age, loss, disappointment, and now, boundaries. I sipped slowly, watching a fishing boat crawl across the horizon. For years, my life revolved around waiting for their visits, their calls, their moments of affection. Now I wondered how much I had missed while sitting in that waiting place. The world continued whether or not I participated in it. I simply hadn't noticed. That afternoon, I sorted through a drawer I'd avoided for ages. The one with old receipts, warranties, scraps of notes once important, but now meaningless. I found a photo of Daniel at 10, holding a trophy nearly as tall as he was. His smile was real then, bright and unburdened. I traced the edge of the photograph with my thumb. I wasn't angry at the boy he'd been. I wasn't even angry at the man, not really. What I felt was something quieter, something that had taken me years to name. Disappointment that had learned to take care of itself. I placed the photograph back gently, not in the drawer, on the mantel, not as a memory to mourn, but as a reminder that love and boundaries can coexist, even when they look nothing alike. Toward evening, the phone buzzed once. A short message from Daniel's number appeared on the screen. We need time to think. That was all. No accusation, no demand, no false sweetness, just time. I let the phone rest on the table and looked out the window again. The sky had deepened into a muted gold, the kind that comes only on cold days when the world feels thin and honest. For the first time in years, I didn't wonder what my children wanted from me. I wondered what I wanted, and the answer was surprisingly simple: a life that belonged to me again. Not loud, not grand, just mine. The kettle clicked off behind me, its sound small and comforting in the stillness. I let it be. I didn't need another cup of tea. I didn't need anything, really, except this steady, quiet certainty that had finally settled into my bones. For so long, I believed my children carried the weight of my life. Now I understood. They were only holding the parts I'd forgotten to claim. And those parts were coming back to me, one peaceful hour at a time. Julia arrived the next afternoon without warning, though she'd texted earlier to ask if I needed groceries. I told her no, but she came anyway, carrying a small bag with lemons, tea, and a fresh loaf of bread. Her kindness was never loud. It was something that moved quietly through rooms, the way sunlight moves across a floor without asking permission. "I didn't want you to spend the day alone," she said, setting the bag on the counter. "I'm not alone," I replied. And it was true in a way I hadn't expected. The quiet no longer felt like an empty house. It felt like a companion, a witness. Still, I was glad to see her. She made us tea while I sat at the table, watching her move around my kitchen with the ease of someone who understood its corners. Her father had never learned its layout. Clara never tried. When Julia finally sat across from me, she folded her hands and waited. Not for instructions, not for a performance of suffering, but for truth. Few people know how to offer that space. "Did they contact you today?" she asked softly. I shook my head. "No, they're thinking." Her mouth tightened. "Dad's not thinking. He's strategizing." I smiled faintly. Perhaps, but let him. Strategy only works when the other side stays still. She looked at me for a long moment, almost studying me. "You sound different," she said. "Like something shifted." I traced the rim of my cup. It did. I spent years telling myself their behavior was normal, that I was imagining things. That age had clouded my judgment. But yesterday, when they stood in my living room and insisted they knew better, I realized something. She leaned in slightly. "What?" "That I have spent more of my life adjusting to other people's comfort than to my own." Julia exhaled, a small sound, half sorrow, half recognition. "Grandma, you didn't deserve that." "No," I said gently, "but I accepted it, and acceptance can look a lot like permission." She swallowed hard, her eyes shining though she wouldn't let them spill. "They don't see you," she whispered. "Not really. They only see what they want you to be." I thought about that. Children rarely see their mothers clearly. They see the woman who fed them, soothed them, forgave them. They see the version that makes their lives easier. They rarely see the person who existed long before they arrived. "I let myself disappear," I said quietly, little by little. Every time I stayed silent. Every time I agreed for the sake of peace. Every time I allowed their urgency to overshadow my instincts. But I'm awake now. And once you see a thing clearly, it's difficult to unsee it. Julia reached across the table and took my hands. Her grip was steady, grounding. "I'm proud of you," she said. "I know that sounds strange to say to your grandmother, but I am." I felt something warm bloom in my chest. Not pride, exactly, but relief. Relief that at least one person in the family still recognized the shape of my humanity. I looked toward the window, where the water glimmered under a pale sky. "Do you remember," I asked, "when you were little, and you used to tell me you wanted to be unscarable when you grew up?" She laughed softly. "I do. I thought bravery meant not feeling anything." "I used to think the same," I said. "But bravery isn't loud. It isn't dramatic. It's choosing truth over comfort, even when the truth sits heavily in your hands." Julia nodded slowly. "So what comes next?" I squeezed her fingers. "Next, I build a life where I don't disappear. And the people who can't accept that will simply have to stand outside the door." We sat together in that warm, quiet kitchen until the sun began to set, casting soft gold across the table. Neither of us spoke for a while. We didn't need to. Some silences aren't punishments. Some silences are beginnings. The next morning, the sky was an unbroken gray, the kind that makes the sea look like brushed steel. I woke before dawn, not from worry, but from clarity. There are moments in life when a decision sits so fully in your chest that you no longer question it. You simply rise and move toward it, the way a tide moves toward shore. Today was that kind of day. I gathered the documents Mr. Whitmore had prepared, placed them carefully in my old leather satchel, and drove into town. The streets were quiet, the shops still closed, but the attorney's office glowed softly from a single lamp inside. He must have heard the door because he stepped into the hallway as I entered, his expression gentle but searching. "Margaret," he said, "are you ready?" I nodded. "More than ready." He guided me back to his office, where the papers lay neatly stacked: the trust documents, the transfer protections, the revised will. Words on paper, yes, but also boundaries, finely written in ink rather than in hopes I'd been too afraid to voice. He explained each page again, though I no longer needed the repetition. My mind was sharp this morning, sharper than it had been in years. As he spoke, I thought of my husband. How he used to say that numbers were never the problem. The real challenge was the courage to follow them wherever they led. The documents led here. When he slid the trust papers toward me, he paused. "Once this is signed," he said softly, "your assets become protected under the trust. Your children cannot access them. They cannot contest them easily. You will remain the primary trustee, and the successor will be—" He glanced down at the name I'd chosen. Julia. Her name looked small on the page, modest, like she always was. But it carried weight. Not because of money, but because trust, real trust, is heavier than any inheritance. "Are you certain?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "She sees me. The others see only what they want." He nodded, handing me the pen. It didn't shake in my hand. I signed with the same decisive stroke I used in my bookkeeping days, the muscle memory returning like an old friend who hadn't forgotten me. When it was done, Mr. Whitmore gathered the papers and pressed them into a folder. "You've taken a strong step," he said. "A wise one." "I'm not trying to punish them," I replied. "I'm just putting things back where they belong. That's often the bravest thing a person can do." I left the office feeling lighter, but not in the way people describe relief. This was a quieter weight, one that settled exactly where it should. Ownership of my choices, of my life. On the way home, I stopped at a small cafe and ordered a bowl of chowder, something I hadn't done alone in years. I sat by the window, watching the fog lift in slow curls. Couples came and went, workers hurried by, and in the midst of all that motion, I felt present. Not as a mother or widow or obligation, but as myself. When I returned home that afternoon, I placed the trust documents in my dresser drawer, beneath my neatly folded sweaters. Not hidden, just resting, waiting for the day they would matter. I knew my children would be furious when they learned. They would interpret this as betrayal, as ingratitude, as rebellion. They would insist they were only protecting me. But protection without permission is not love, and silence without choice is not peace. I stood by the window for a long time, watching the sea breathe in slow, patient waves. The trust was signed. The boundaries were real now. The next storm would come, I had no doubt. But for the first time in many years, I wouldn't meet it unarmed. They didn't wait long. 2 days passed with no word, no apology, no honest conversation. Just a silence thick enough to feel deliberate. I spent those days quietly, sweeping the porch, listening to the gulls, rereading old recipes I hadn't made in years. There was peace in it, a peace built not from avoidance but from choosing myself for once. But storms don't stay offshore forever. Late in the afternoon, when the fog was beginning to thin, their car appeared at the end of my driveway. Daniel's dark sedan, Clara in the passenger seat. Both of them sitting stiffly, like people preparing for battle. They didn't call first. They didn't ask to visit. They arrived the way people do when they believe entry is a right, not a request. I opened the door before they could knock. Their expressions told me everything. "Mom," Daniel said without greeting, "we need to talk. Now." I stepped aside, but only enough to let them in if they chose to behave. They crossed the threshold without waiting for permission. Clara didn't bother with pleasantries. "We spoke to a friend at the bank. He said your accounts are locked. Completely locked." "What exactly did you do?" "I protected myself," I said. "From us?" Her voice cracked with disbelief. Real or performed, I couldn't tell. Daniel dropped into a chair at the table, frustration radiating off him. "Mom, you've caused a mess. The financial advisor is confused. Our accountant is asking questions we can't answer. And now," he gestured toward the window in some irritated arc, "now we hear you've drafted legal documents?" I met his gaze calmly. "Yes." "What documents?" Clara demanded. "My affairs," I answered. "Handled by me?" She laughed, short, humorless. "You're not capable of managing all this. You know that." "I am capable," I replied. "I always was. You simply preferred the version of me that didn't question anything." Daniel leaned forward, folding his hands in a gesture meant to look patient. "Mom, this isn't about control. This is about safety. You're making choices without thinking them through." "I've thought about very little else," I said softly. A flash of something, fear maybe, crossed his face, though he masked it quickly. "We took care of everything for you. Bills, accounts, paperwork. You took control," I corrected. "That is not the same as care." Clara paced the room, her heels tapping sharply against the floorboards. "So what now? You're rewriting your will? Giving everything to strangers? To—" She stopped herself, but the implication hung in the air. "To Julia," I finished for her. Daniel stood so abruptly his chair scraped against the floor. "You did that? You actually changed the will? After everything we've done for you?" I held his gaze steadily. "I changed it because of everything you've done." His face flushed. Mom, that's betrayal." "No," I said. "Betrayal is using someone's signature without permission. Betrayal is opening accounts in my name. Betrayal is insisting I'm confused so you can manage what isn't yours." The room went very still. Clara stopped pacing. Daniel's mouth tightened into a thin, pained line. They weren't used to seeing me like this. Not angry, but unwavering. Daniel tried again, softer this time, using the voice he reserved for negotiations. "We can fix this," he said. "Undo what you signed. We'll start fresh. No lawyers, no drama, just us." I shook my head. I'm done starting over. I'm done being handled. Clara stepped closer, her voice trembling with something she mistook for righteousness. "So, you're cutting your own children out of your life?" I considered her words carefully. "No. I'm allowing you to step out if you choose. I'm not closing a door. I'm just no longer keeping it unlocked for people who don't bother to knock." Neither spoke. For a long moment, they stood there. Two adults who had once been children I carried, fed, forgave. Now strangers orbiting around a version of me that had ceased to exist. Finally, Daniel exhaled shakily. "If this is how you want it, fine." They walked out without another word. The house felt lighter the moment the door clicked shut. Not because they were gone, but because I finally stayed. The house felt unusually still the morning after Daniel and Clara left, as if even the walls were adjusting to a new kind of quiet. I moved slowly through the rooms, touching the back of a chair here, straightening a picture frame there. Not out of nervousness, just acknowledgement. These small things had witnessed so much, years of compromise, years of shrinking myself to fit inside other people's comfort. And now, finally, a shift. The sea outside was calm. A soft gray ribbon stretched across the horizon, the surface barely rippling. I stood at the window for a long time, breathing in that stillness as though it were something I had waited decades to inhale. Perhaps I had. I made myself oatmeal and sat at the kitchen table, the morning light catching on the rim of my spoon. No messages, no demands, no footsteps in my driveway. Their silence felt different today, not as punishment, but as distance finally allowed to settle where it belonged. Love doesn't disappear when boundaries appear. It simply becomes honest. Around mid-morning, Julia arrived. She didn't knock right away. I saw her through the window, hesitating on the porch, her breath clouding softly in the cold air. I opened the door before she raised her hand. "You don't need to ask," I said. "You're always welcome." She stepped inside, cheeks rosy from the wind. "I didn't want to intrude," she said. "You don't," I replied. "Not you." She smiled a little, setting her bag down. "Dad's not talking to me," she admitted quietly. "He said I encouraged you." I poured her tea and motioned for her to sit. "You didn't encourage me," I said. "You reminded me I'm still here." She swallowed, her eyes softening. "Are you okay?" I nodded. Better than I expected. Better than they expected, I suppose. We sat in companionable silence for a while. She looked around the house as though seeing it differently, less like a place where an old woman lived, and more like a place that finally made room for its owner again. After a moment, she said, "I'm proud of you. I know I've said it before, but I mean it." I reached across the table and took her hand. Her fingers were warm, steady, full of a quiet loyalty that didn't need to prove itself. "You don't know how much that means," I said. But maybe she did. Young people sometimes see more clearly than we give them credit for. Later, after she'd gone to class, I stepped outside onto the porch. The boards creaked beneath me, the same familiar complaint they'd made for years, but now it felt like greeting, not burden. The air smelled of salt and wood smoke drifting from a neighbor's chimney. I wrapped my shawl tighter around my shoulders and walked down the steps. I hadn't taken a walk in weeks, not since the tension began with Daniel and Clara. As I followed the curve of the street, the cold breeze brushing against my face, I realized how much of my life I'd lived waiting for someone else's approval. How much of myself I'd handed over, piece by piece, not because I was weak, but because I believed love required shrinking. But love doesn't ask you to disappear, and age doesn't make your life any less yours. By the time I reached the edge of the breakwater, the sun had pushed through the clouds, a thin, bright line stretching across the water. The waves moved gently, as though the whole sea had decided to exhale. I closed my eyes and let the wind press against me, steady and unafraid. I had made choices my children wouldn't approve of. I had reclaimed what they'd mistaken for abandon. I had drawn boundaries they would resent. But I had done it with a clear mind, a steady heart, and the knowledge that dignity isn't something you protect once. It's something you choose again and again, quietly, without applause. And maybe one day they'll understand. Maybe they won't. But that understanding no longer determines the shape of my days. I turned back toward the house, each step light, deliberate. For the first time in years, I felt entirely like myself. And if someone reading this has ever been talked over, dismissed, or told they don't understand their own life, take this from an old woman who finally remembered her worth. Don't wait for permission to protect what belongs to you.